Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bill of Rights Institute AP Government Content Review webinar. We're happy to have you here back with us on a Monday to prepare for the upcoming AP Government and Politics test. Tonight's webinar is going to specifically focus on the legislative branch, Congress. I'm your BRI host, Liz Evans. If you've been around, you've seen my face. I'm the Regional Programs Manager here at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I taught AP Gov for 6 years. So I'm going to be monitoring the chat and answering as many questions as I can. Joining me tonight is another familiar face you should know by now, is Paul Sargent from Hershey, Pennsylvania, who has taught AP Gov for 15 years. We're happy to have him back and talking about the legislative branch tonight. So take it away, Paul.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Tonight is night 2 of the AP Gov content review. So we're going to be going over the legislative branch. So let's waste no time and let's get going. So here we go. Session 2 of the 2021 AP US Government and Politics webinar. All right, the legislative branch is what we're doing here. All right, so I always like to start off with a big idea. Now, this big idea is the big idea that covers all of Unit 2. So you're going to see this tonight. You're going to see it tomorrow night when we go over the executive branch and the bureaucracy, and you're going to see it on Wednesday night when we go over the judicial branch. So just so that you know, you're going to be seeing this a few times. But the big idea comes straight from the College Board. Because power is widely distributed and checks prevent one branch from usurping powers from the others, institutional actors are in the position where they must both compete and cooperate in order to govern. So distribution of power is really sort of the big story of the branches of government, dividing up, distributing power so that there is no concentration of power, which becomes too problematic. And it really is a fear, and the founders had this coming out of the British Empire, of one branch usurping powers from the others. Remember that under the British rule, the colonists really felt like they were getting no representation, but that the king himself, King George III, was making too many rash decisions that really affected them, and there was no real way for them to to fight those decisions. And also, you have to understand that lawmaking and carrying out laws and all of that involves competition and cooperation. So you'll find branches of government will sometimes compete with each other in order to govern, and sometimes they'll cooperate. And you need a little bit of both in order to get policy carried out. So we're going to start off with this enduring understanding here. This is, again, right from the College Board. I like putting their words in here because it really, if we know what they're asking and we know what they're saying, then it gives us a hint as to what might be on the exam. So the Republican ideal in the US is manifested in the structure and operation of the legislative branch, okay? And that's really sort of setting it out. The legislative branch is Republican in that, not Republican with a big R, meaning the party, but Republican with a little r, meaning that we elect people to represent us and to make decisions for us in this branch. So we'll start off with a few different functions of Congress. First of all, Congress, and this is kind of like the main one, Congress is in charge of lawmaking. They're there to make laws for the United States. And in our 3-branch government, making the laws is sort of their area of expertise. The executive branch then enforces those laws, and the judicial branch can choose to interpret those laws if they want to. But Congress also functions as a representation tool so that the interests, the opinions, the concerns of people all around the country from 435 different congressional districts are represented, so that if people feel one way in certain parts of the country, those opinions should be reflected in congressional representation. They're also there to do service for constituents. Individual Congress people are often involved in doing things that can help out people who live in their district. Maybe it's helping them with immigration problems, or helping them through tax audits, or some sort of way in which they can use their position on Capitol Hill to help out the people who live in their district. They're also involved in oversight. And this becomes really big when we talk about the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy, you'll find out tomorrow night, is really tasked with actually implementing the laws, actually taking the laws that Congress wrote and sort of making them work on the ground. And when that power is delegated from Congress to the bureaucracy, in other words, Congress makes the laws and then these other people are actually doing them. Congress has to provide some sort of oversight to make sure the laws they passed are being implemented in the correct way. So that can involve, like you see in the picture here, some sort of oversight hearing. It can involve bringing in witnesses and having them testify about whatever the thing is. This was the investigation, or one of the investigations into the 2016 elections. Congress also works to educate the public. So as public policy is being formed, let's say the law which was just recently passed, which gave direct payments to individuals and families throughout the United States to help with COVID relief, in order to make sure that that law was, perceived the right way. Congress people worked to inform the public about why they were going out spending what amounted to $1.9 trillion, and advocating for the benefits of the law that they decided to write. And then Congress is also there for conflict resolution, to try and find solutions to conflicts that arise around the country, be it conflicts between states, and not in like a judicial way, not hearing court cases or anything like that, but finding solutions that can help everybody. Whether it's conflicts over pollution or conflicts over trade, or sort of many other things that they might get into. So Congress is based on the idea of bicameralism, the idea that we have two houses of government, two houses of Congress. Sorry, there's the House of Representatives and there is the Senate. Now, the House of Representatives was really designed to represent the national population. Remember, under the Virginia plan, it was proposed that we have a House which reflected population, so that states that had more people would have more representation in Congress. And under the Great Compromise, that was included as the House of Representatives. And so, because it represents the people as they are distributed around the country, it tends to reflect the national population part of a federalist system. The Senate, on the other hand, represents the interests of the states. So you would expect that things that have opposition in certain states are going to have a harder time in the Senate than they are in the House of Representatives. All right. Now, in order for legislation to pass, both houses are needed. Both houses have to pass legislation with a simple majority vote in order to get this through. But it does take both. Now, right now, we have a House and a Senate, which are both which both have Democratic majorities in them. And so the Democrats are in a good position to be able to pass legislation because they have a more majority in both houses. Last year, this time, we were working in a different system where the Democrats had the majority in the House, but the Republicans had the majority in the Senate, which makes it much more difficult to pass legislation if they don't agree on things. All right, so some basic differences between these two houses so that you know, and I've kind of got them laid out here, but let me just go through them with you here. So the House has 435 members. Now, it's important to know that this number is not set by anything other than Congress itself. When the House reached 435 members about 100 years ago, they kind of decided that that was already too many people. And so they set a cap. Now, a little known fact that I actually just found out today, the House of Representatives actually jumped up to 437 members briefly when Alaska and Hawaii were made states, but then it was brought back. They decided to bring the number back down to 435. So that number could change at any time, but it hasn't changed for 100 years, so probably not going to change anytime soon. The Senate, on the other hand, is a constitutionally designated number. It's 100. Each state gets 2 members in the Senate. Now, while this is 100 right now, this can change. Right now, there are talks of Washington, D.C. and of Puerto Rico applying for statehood. And if either or both of those become states, then this number would automatically go up. And it can't be worked like the House number can. Now, the House, as I've said before, it has proportional representation by the population of states. So the larger states, California, for example, have much larger delegations, and the very smallest states in terms of population, like Wyoming, for example, only have one representative. Whereas in the Senate, they have equal representation. So again, using our two extremes, California and Wyoming, California has, I believe, 53 representatives in the House of Representatives. Wyoming has one. In the Senate, California has 2 senators, Wyoming has 2 senators. So there is a balance shift there. The House works off of 2-year terms. The founders believed that this was important to make the House very responsible, very answerable to the public. That their cycle of a 2-year term would be so ongoing that they would really have to listen to what their constituents thought. The Senate, on the other hand, works on 6-year terms. And so those senators are less accountable to the people because they have a longer term in office, especially senators who say were elected in November, this past November. They're 5.5 years out from their next election. So right now, what they're doing is not going to affect their reelection hopes as much as it is all of the people in the House of Representatives. And in the House, each member is elected from a district within a state. That state is divided up into districts based on population again. So here in Pennsylvania, we have 18 representatives. So there are 18 districts that are designed out. In Wyoming, there's 1 district. And so it's just the state. In the Senate, understand that both senators from a state are separately elected by the entire state. So it's not like they divide the state in half and only represent half of it. Both senators are elected by the entire state. All right. So in terms of what powers Congress does, we're going to highlight just a few of these, right? Now, the enumerated powers, if you were with us on Friday night, you know these are powers which are specifically listed in the Constitution. So Article 1, Section 8 has basically the list of all the powers that Congress has. But there are a few that are important to know. And I highlight these because the College Board highlights these. So going into the exam, you really want to make sure that you have a pretty good handle on these powers, and other powers that are outside of this, really you don't need to worry about so much because the College Board says you don't have to worry about them so much. So regulating commerce is very, very, very important, all right? Everything that has to do with trade across state lines or internationally is regulated or can be regulated by Congress. The tax and spending power is really big. Now, this is a hint that I always give my students. Whenever you're writing, or even whenever you're taking a multiple choice question, and something comes up about congressional powers, especially when it has to do with the congressional checks on other branches. One thing you can always think about is their ability to tax and spend. It's called the power of the purse. So they're the ones who raise money by charging taxes, make tax law, and they're also the ones who spend money. So they pass budget bills that allocates money to different agencies and parts of the government. They have the ability to take that away, so they can choose if there's if something isn't going so well in a department, they can choose to defund the department completely if they want to. It doesn't happen very often, but it's certainly in the possibility. They also have the power to declare war, and it's important to take a moment on this. The Senate has the power to declare war. The president, as the head of the executive branch, is the one who's in power of implementing that war, just like the executive branch implements laws, implementing the war, in other words, fighting it. Now, sometimes this brings them into conflict because the president, as commander in chief, and we'll get into this a little bit more tomorrow, can send troops out at any time to any place. They don't need a declaration of war. In fact, the last time that Congress formally declared war was in World War II. So we've certainly done a lot of fighting and a lot of warring since World War II, none of which have been declared. So there is a little bit of a problem, not a problem, but there is a little bit of a disconnect there. So when you're learning this stuff, when you're reviewing this stuff, think Congress has the power to declare war. Doesn't mean you have to declare a war in order to fight one, but they do have that power. And then I don't know why I put this in here twice, raising money, I guess because, it's kind of tax season. And so I have taxes on the brain. But yes, raising money and raising taxes is part of the enumerated powers of Congress. Now, the other thing that kind of is important to understand about congressional powers is this elastic clause. So this comes at the end of Article 1, Section 8, where the provision says the Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, all those ones that were listed ahead of it, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Now, if we go with the definition of necessary and proper and understand that the only people who really define necessary and proper in any practical way is Congress itself, then we have to understand that this is an important provision. It's called the elastic clause because as Congress uses it to do things, to fund things, to carry out things, whatever, they stretch congressional power, just like you would stretch a rubber band or, right around Thanksgiving time, an elastic waistband, perhaps. But yeah, so the necessary and proper thing kind of gives them a whole lot more power, which is outside of those enumerated powers. And that brings us to these things called implied powers. All right, implied powers really extend the powers of the federal government. And this was upheld by the Supreme Court in the court cases of McCulloch versus Maryland. This was the case that I mentioned yesterday when I was talking, or Friday when I was talking about federalism, and the Supreme Court did in fact say that implied powers do exist because of the elastic clause. And so really what Congress does is they use these powers to address a wide range of issues. Congress does a lot right now. And it's a lot more than is actually laid out in the Constitution. But a good example of this is right here. You've got some men standing in the, and this is, I apologize for the quality of the photo here, but standing in a part of the construction under the Federal Aid Highway Act, okay? The federal government undertook it to construct a federal highway system, all of the interstates that we all make use of around the country. And this was a project in the 1950s, which was undertaken under the implied powers. See, Congress has the enumerated powers, the enumerated power of regulating interstate commerce. And so, if you can regulate commerce, isn't it implied that you can make roads which make commerce easier? Let's face it, it's a lot faster to drive on an interstate than it is to drive through all the little towns along a regular road. All right, so to break it up into our two houses, let's take a minute to look at the House of Representatives. This is Nancy Pelosi, the current Speaker of the House here. The House of Representatives has special powers, and the most special of them is that they initiate all revenue bills. Anything that raises money has to start in the House. This is a constitutional provision made because these people, again, remember, they're being elected on 2-year cycles, so they're very close to the people in terms of accountability. They have to look to them for re-election so often, and so anytime they're going to raise taxes, that should be, the House, which is the closest to the people. The House of Representatives does have more formal rules and organization. There are a lot of reasons for this. I like to break it down to the very simple one that you're dealing with 435 people rather than 100 people in the Senate. So with almost 4.5 times as many people in the House of Representatives, they need to have more formal rules about how to go through debate and discussion and all of those sorts of things. There are certain constitutional eligibility requirements for membership in Congress. Person to be elected has to be at least 25 years old, has to have been a citizen for 7 years, and has to be a resident of the state that's represented. Now, I always tell my students that when you're thinking about the eligibility for membership, when you look at years, like how old you have to be, the founders made it nice and easy for us. They give us 5-year increments, so 25 to be in the House, 30 to be in the Senate, 35 to be President of the United States. And it shows kind of a progression. You want to have people who are older in these different positions. Now, that doesn't mean that we're electing a whole lot of 25-year-olds to Congress. We don't elect a whole lot of 25-year-olds, but we do elect some. And certainly they wanted to put a base age on there. Also notice that citizenship just has to be a certain amount of time. People who become citizens of the United States who are naturalized are certainly eligible to serve in the House of Representatives, and we have some serving currently. The Senate, this is Chuck Schumer, the majority leader of the House of Representatives, really has, according to the Constitution, a bunch of advise and consent powers. Now, an easy way to think about this is whenever the president needs some certification of something that he does in order for it to take place, it's the Senate who does it. So, and this isn't perfect, but just bear with me here. So if he wants to go fight a war, he would theoretically need the Senate to declare that war. If he wants to put someone on the Supreme Court, then he needs the Senate to approve that person. If he wants to appoint an ambassador, he needs Congress to approve those things. So anything advise and consent follows along there. Things like approving nominations. These would be people who are nominated for public office, whether that's part of the cabinet or whether that's ambassadors, all kinds of things. Ratifying treaties are part of the Senate's advise and consent powers. Very famously, after World War I, the Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Senate works off of less formal procedures. Again, if you think about it, with 100 people, they can afford to let people be a little bit less formal. And I guess what I mean when I say less formal is discussions aren't as structured as they are in the House of Representatives. There aren't necessarily time limits. There often aren't time limits on how long individual senators can talk, whereas in the House of Representatives, there definitely are. It could be a real problem if all of them could talk as much as they wanted to. In order to be eligible for membership in the Senate, someone has to be at least 30 years old. There's that 5-year thing. They have to be a citizen for 9 years. So now they're required to be a part of the United States for a little bit longer. And again, they have to live in the state that they represent. State residency they saw as being very important. The founders did, in order to make that person really represent the state. And the Senate has the power of the filibuster, at least for now. There continuously are talks about whether to eliminate the filibuster, and in many circumstances, the filibuster has been eliminated. For example, it's no longer possible to filibuster a judicial nomination, especially for the Supreme Court. But the overall filibuster, what it does, it allows an individual senator or group of senators to talk as long as they want to, in order to delay legislation, in order to really slow down the process, or perhaps prevent the process altogether. What's interesting about the filibuster is that people in the Senate don't have to say, like, there's no law saying that they have to talk about whatever the bill is that's being considered. So you have some weird things happen during filibusters. A few years ago, Senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, read green eggs and ham to his kids when it was bedtime as part of a filibuster that he was conducting. So you just never know what you're going to get. Now, when these two houses come together, they most often are engaged in some sort of lawmaking. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through this entire infographic here. But what I like about this is I like that it shows you that there's a whole lot going on here. And, if you look at this real quickly, you see all kind of moments where there are committee votes and calendaring and marking up and different input from different people, lobbyists, all kinds of things in order to kind of work through the process. This is probably not even as complicated as it actually is, but more complicated than you need to know. So we'll take a simpler look at the process. So number one, you have an idea. Thank you, USA.gov. Every law starts with an idea. Number two, you have a bill that is introduced. Bills can be written by anyone. And oftentimes bills are written by a group such as interest groups or lobbyists or something like that. But it has to be introduced by a member of Congress in order to get it going. Then the bill goes to the committee, and committees we'll talk about in a moment. They do the real work of Congress, and so it's then discussed within the committee, and they decide whether or not to pass it on to the full House or the full Senate. Then you have a congressional debate and a vote. Both houses have to approve the same version of the bill in order for it to go to the president. Now, this is important to understand. If the House and the Senate, and this happens very often, if the House and the Senate both approve slightly different parts, slightly different bills, then what usually happens is they go and they form what's called a conference committee, where you have members from both houses that come together and they look over the past, the two bills which have passed, the one from the House and the one from the Senate. They identify differences and then they try and talk them out. So they come to what's called a consensus bill, one that's exactly the same, that they then, because of the rules of the Constitution, have to take back to both houses in order to have a revote on it. Now, sometimes they don't go through that whole process. So again, this COVID relief bill that was passed just last month, I believe, I think it was last month, was one in which the House and the Senate had both passed it, but the House bill had I believe it had a provision for a $15 minimum wage. I think that's what the big difference was, and the one that was passed by the Senate, they didn't have that. What they decided to do in that case, rather than going back and hashing this all out, is they just took the Senate bill back to the House and they said, look, here's what the Senate passed. We're just going to pass the same thing. And then they did. So after that vote happens, then it goes to the president. The president has two choices. Really, they can sign it or they can veto it. There are different ways to veto it, but we'll go through that tomorrow night. Now, congressional committees are really where all of the work gets done. I mean, let's face it, if you're talking about the House of Representatives and there are 435 people, they're not going to get a lot of stuff done. I mean, think when you go to some sort of an assembly, if there are 435 people in the room, like, you're not going to come to decisions on things. You're not going to be able to really talk anything out. So in congressional committees, what they do is they really divide up the work. They get it into smaller groups so that it can be worked through. Now, what you see here is you see permanent and standing and permanent select committees that exist in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And what you see is that they're divided up by sort of topics, so we have agriculture, we have education and the workforce, we have homeland security, those sorts of things in the House of Representatives side. Senate, they're close, but they're not always exactly the same thing. So, rather than education and workforce, they have health, education, labor, and pensions, so there are some slight differences there. But basically what happens is congressional committees improve decision-making because they have two things. Number one, they have specialization. So typically when congressmen are first elected into office, they're appointed to committees by their party. Now, the party is going to ask them for their preferences. If, for example, someone comes from the Midwest, let's say from Nebraska, they might very well want to be on the Agriculture Committee because agriculture is a big thing in Nebraska, and so they're going to want to put them there. But as they continue to get reelected, they will typically tend to stay on the same committees. And so they really get specialized. They really understand, they gain expertise in their field. And it also improves decision-making by division of labor. Simply, with all of these committees working at the same time, they can get a lot more done than if they were all 435 people together. Now, standing committees are permanent subject matter groups. Now, permanent, you always have to kind of put quotes around that. They're permanent for now. just doesn't mean that they're not going to be regularly disbanded. Okay, they're gonna continue on, and you can see subject matter, they kind of continue. And the members of the committee are really what we call party agents. In other words, the party, whether it be the Republicans or the Democrats, have given agency, have given ownership to them basically over a particular area of policy, and they've entrusted these committee members to work in the best interest of the party, because there's not going to be complete oversight all the time. Now, members tend to get on committees that help their constituents as much as they can. Now, there are some really some really high profile committees, things like appropriations, things like Homeland Security, things like Ways and Means, the ones that deal with paying out money tend to be really, really big ones. But there are other areas where, this Veterans Affairs Committee, it may be people on there are on there because they are veterans themselves, or maybe they represent districts where there is a large veterans hospital or something. So they want to work to help that out. Now, the majority party, it's important to understand, really controls everything. They control the leadership. So in the House of Representatives, you have the Speaker of the House, who currently, as I said, is Nancy Pelosi. Always the Speaker of the House is from the majority party. In the Senate, there is no speaker, but the majority leader in the Senate is the one who is the leader of the Senate, because they lead the majority party in the Senate and they have more votes than anyone else. But also, it's important to understand that the majority party has, how should I phrase this? The chairpersons of all the committees are representatives from the majority party. And each chairperson is the one in their committee who decides what order they're going to discuss things and how long they're going to consider things, even what to consider. So minority party members have a hard time not only getting their bills onto the docket of the committee, but they have an even harder time getting their bills to and past the main floor. Now, the majority party also controls the flow of bills. So they can decide what they're going to be voting on, when they're going to be voting on it. And they can move their party's bills up to the head of the line, or party priorities up to the head of the line, in order to show, in order to get accomplished what they want to get accomplished, and thus show people around the country, hey, our party is really doing something for you. Now, if you look at this infographic here, this shows you sort of the current makeup of the House and the Senate. So you can see that the Democrats have a slight majority of 10 votes in the House of Representatives. They have an actual 50 vote count, although there are 2 independents, but you see the little asterisk there, a caucus with the Democrats, which means that they typically vote as Democrats, but they were elected as independents. So right now, the Democrats are pretty happy with their majorities. They wish they had bigger majorities, obviously, but this is enough to get things done. Now, the one important committee to know about is the House Rules Committee. Okay, and the majority party runs the House Rules Committee. And in the House of Representatives, after something comes out, after a bill comes out of committee, it goes to the House Rules Committee, and the House Rules Committee will attach rules for debate and voting onto that bill. So it may be that if it's like a high priority bill, for example, they may put a debate limit on it, saying that each party, the Republicans, the Democrats, can only have 10 people speak for or against this bill, and each speaker can only speak for 2 minutes, they might say, in order to just get rid of all of the extra debate, have each party pull down to like their main talking points, and then let's get this thing through, because this has to be passed quickly. One of the toughest things to pass through Congress has to do with budgets. Now, I'm just going to caution you here. The budgeting can be an extremely confusing and extremely involved process, but I'm going to try and just make it as simple as possible, just give you a little taste of it. And hopefully that's enough to get you through on the exam. Now understand there are two types of spending in the budget. First of all is mandatory spending. It's mandatory, it's stuff they have to do. And really this is set out by law. So for example, we have Social Security benefits here in the United States. And the Social Security benefits that an individual receives is a like set number based on how long they worked in their lives and how much money they made each year. But the law is there saying exactly what it has. So Congress can't just decide to cut, Social Security benefits by 20% unless they pass a new law to go through and do that. So it's mandatory. One of the biggest programs underneath mandatory spending are what are called entitlements. Okay, these are programs that give direct benefits to citizens, be it direct payments, something like Social Security, or direct like medical care, like Medicare. Those are entitlement programs. Now, there are also parts of the budget which are discretionary, and this means that these people have the discretion to change, for whatever reason they want to, the amount that's being spent on that. And so the amounts there are not set by the budget, the amounts are set by Congress. And the Congress creates the budget, I guess that's what I meant. So it can vary from year to year without having to go through any legislation in order to change it. Now, what budgeting really amounts to these days, and by these days, I mean, it's been a long time we've been doing this, is deficit spending, okay? The reality of modern federal budgeting is that we always spend more than we collect. And so under a deficit spending model, we borrow money to cover the costs that we have. And so we're able to spend the money that we want in the United States because we're able to borrow enough money to keep everything going. So when you look at something like our $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, that money was not made up by collecting taxes or anything. That money was simply put on to the total amount of money that we owe, which is known as the national debt. Okay, and the current national debt, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's right about $21 trillion right now, which is a whole lot of money. It's the debt that we've incurred over time. So total amount that we owe. So the more deficit spending we do, the higher the national debt goes up. There have been years in which we've been able to have a surplus where we've actually brought in more money than we've spent. But the last year we did that was the year 2000. And I don't think any of you were alive back then, so you can tell how long it's been. So I wanted to show you this real quickly. Not that you need to see the numbers or anything like that, but I just want to show you, like, this is 2019's number. So you can see here, mandatory spending was $2.7 trillion. And the vast majority of it, if you look, I mean, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid is almost half of the whole thing. The discretionary spending added up to $1.3 trillion out of that. That included defense spending, which is very large, $676 billion. And then non-defense spending would be like lots of other things that we do. You can see there, transportation, education, veterans benefits, whatever. Okay, so in 2019, the budget had a spending amount of $4.4 trillion. Now look at the other graph. Up in the upper right, this is revenues. This is how much is brought in. Now, it's important to understand the number one source of revenue in the United States are individual income taxes, made up in 2019, $1.7 trillion. Okay, that's a lot of money being brought in. Payroll taxes and other taxes brought in, and corporate income taxes brought in the rest of it, just a little bit over 50%. And so you can see the revenues were $3.5 trillion. The reason I talk about this is because, look, we collected $3.5 trillion, we spent $4.4 trillion. That is deficit spending. There are some hurdles when you go through and make a budget. And yes, you see how thick these books are? That's how thick the budget is when you put it on paper. All right. So really, here's the fundamental problem of budgeting, okay, is that if you want to have a balanced budget means that you are collecting as much, you're bringing in as much money as you're spending. It's that simple, right? But from where we are right now, there's really only two ways to get there. If we're spending almost $1 trillion more than we bring in, we could increase revenue. We could raise taxes. Problem with raising taxes, of course, is that's not popular with the voters. No one really wins elections by going through and saying, if you elect me, I'll raise your taxes. It's not a big, not a big line. People don't go like, oh, cool, right on. You will be helping the budget. Yeah. All right. But the other way to do it is by decreasing spending. These are really the only two things you can do. Unless you want to go you want to go down some dangerous paths of printing your own money and things like that. Didn't work out so well for the Germans. Just say that. So you could decrease spending by cutting programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, stuff like that. But again, who gets elected by saying, hey, if you elect me, I'm going to cut your Social Security benefits. I'm going to get rid of Medicare, old people. Go ahead and go out there and vote for me. I don't think it's going to happen. So, of course, the easy answer is, well, how about a bit of both? Raise taxes a little bit, decrease spending a little bit. The numbers are too big to make it really feasible. And so politically, what happens is that both parties kind of just sign on to keep the deficit spending going so that they can continue to get the votes that they need. Pork barrel spending can also be a hurdle to the budget, where special projects are set aside for individual members' districts, maybe not funneling, that's the wrong word, it sounds corrupt, by allocating bits of money for specific projects that benefit just one small part of the country, but might get important votes on important legislation. And log rolling. Log rolling is really just a folksy little term that really, as far as I know, it's mostly just used in government classes and in government. And this is when different representatives will help each other. Kind of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing. You vote for my bill, I'll vote for yours kind of thing. It involves them kind of working together and doing trade-off negotiations. So when we talk about what really happens, the question is there gridlock or is there compromise? And part of the real problem has to do with ideology. We now have a Congress which is very ideologically divided. Conservatives tend to be more conservative than they ever have. Liberals tend to be more liberal than they ever have. And the middle ground, those moderate voices that tend to make compromise, are not really around in Congress right now. And so the question is, what do you get when you have these ideological divisions? Sometimes you get gridlock, meaning that nothing happens. Two sides can't agree on anything. And sometimes you get compromise. It's really kind of a crapshoot. Now, another thing that you need to understand about Congress, and this is actually going to come up very soon, is how Congress responds to population changes. See, every 10 years, the US Census Bureau goes out and conducts the census. This was done last year. Kind of problematic with COVID, but they were able to make it happen. And they count every person in the United States according to the Constitution. That's what they're supposed to do. And then because Congress is made up, or because Congress has its votes divided up based on population, they have to go through this process, called reapportionment. And under reapportionment, what they do is they look at which states have gained in population and which states have maybe lost population, although lost population isn't really a big thing. It's more of which states have grown faster than others. And so you'll see this is a map from reapportionment after the 2010 census. And you'll see that the states in orange there actually lost a representative because their population had not grown fast enough to keep that share. And those states in the dark blue gained representatives as a result of huge population gain. And what you can see here is that looks like people are moving south and west. And so you have losses in places like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, all these other places over there, and gains in like Texas and Florida and all of that. So this will always then add up to 435. The only rule other than population distribution is that every state has to have at least one. So you can see some states in there that just have their one representatives, not a lot of them, but they are there. So what happens next is that then when states get their new number, so let me just go back for a second. Let's say you're from Pennsylvania, because I'm from Pennsylvania. Prior to the 2010 census, we had 19 representatives. 2010 census comes around, it gets reapportioned. Now we have 18. Now, the population numbers that the Census Bureau publishes are not just like total state numbers. They get a whole lot more, specific than that, which can lead to gerrymandering. So what happens is each state is then given their population numbers and their number of reapportioned districts. So when Pennsylvania in 2011 or 2012, whenever it was, got their numbers, here's your population statistics down to like the city block, and you have 18 districts. Well, then the state legislature goes through and has to actually draw boundaries to create districts. You can look on the right, this is Pennsylvania's 7th. And these little lines, the edges of this stuff, can run along roads, they can run along parks, they can run along maybe a stream or something, whatever they want, but they have to run somewhere. So they have to sit down and figure out on a map exactly how to do all of this. Now, what gerrymandering is going through this redistricting process in order to gain a political advantage, in order to make it so that elections are more predictable and more favor, usually, the party that's in power in the state legislature, if you followed that. So in Pennsylvania, again, I'm going to use this as an example, Republicans had the majority in the state legislature after the 2010 census. And so they redistricted to try and give more advantage to Republican candidates. How do you do that? Well, there are really two ways to do it. Let me see if I got it. No, I don't have it there. Okay. So there's really two ways to do it. Number one is called packing. If you have huge concentrations of, let's say, Democratic voters, the Republican majority could pack a lot of them into one district so that one district is maybe like 75% Democrat, but take them away from districts surrounding it so that Republicans can win seats around one Democratic district. The other way is called cracking, where you basically divide populations up into different districts. So you get really weirdly shaped district like the Pennsylvania 7th here, which is in red. Now, Baker versus Carr in 1961 is a Supreme Court case that you need to know. And essentially, what it said is the Supreme Court upheld the idea of one man, one vote. The idea that these districts have to be redrawn after every census in order to maintain population equality, or pretty close to it. So that if there are 18 districts in Pennsylvania, all 18 have roughly the same amount of population. Shaw versus Reno came around in 1993, and Shaw versus Reno tried to stop racial gerrymandering, where the districts would be created in order to create majority racial districts. All right, and so what happens is when you have when you have well gerrymandered districts, the outcomes of the elections are almost set, because they're redistricted in a way to give a majority to a certain political party. If that happens, what happens is the people who are being elected out of that. Now, I'm not sure about the Pennsylvania 7th, but let's say since it's red, this is a Republican district. I kind of doubt it because of the shape of it, and I forget. I think it's around Philadelphia, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, this is a Republican district. Okay, if that district has, let's say, 70% Republican voters and 30% Democratic voters, who's going to win the election every time? The Republican. And so the real contest is in the primary, when Republicans are going to run against Republicans. And in those sorts of situations, in those sorts of districts, the Republican who is the most Republican, think most conservative, tends to win those. And so if you have then pushed this out, we have We have gerrymandered Republican districts. We have gerrymandered Democratic districts all around the country. Those the gerrymandered Democratic districts are getting very liberal Democrats elected. The gerrymandered Republican districts are getting very conservative Republicans elected. There isn't going to be a lot of middle ground. So you're going to have a polarized Congress that comes out of this, and that can lead us to some real problems. Now, one of the things that you get out of elections is called divided government. Divided government is when you have, let's say, the House of one party, House of Representatives is run by one party and the Senate's run by another, or Congress is a different party than the president. That's what we call divided government. And of course, if you have ideologically opposing sides, that's going to limit the effectiveness of Congress itself. It leads to things like we see here, federal government shutdowns, where budget bills aren't passed, and so parts of the federal government will shut down. A lot of this is because partisan or party line voting has become very much the rule, the norm throughout in Congress. So Republicans tend to vote with Republicans, Democrats tend to vote with Democrats, and they really don't move those lines very often, especially on controversial legislation. If it's not very controversial or not a big law, then you'll see a lot more movement. This can lead to things like refusing to confirm presidential appointments. If the president is of one party and well, go back to the last year of Barack Obama's presidency. Barack Obama nominated a Supreme Court justice, and the Senate, who was majority Republican at the time, Obama was a Democrat, refused to hold hearings to confirm the Supreme Court nominee until after the presidential election. They said, let's wait and see how this presidential election plays out. And we're not just going to confirm this right now. They can do that. It also leads to political maneuvering, so that you have a lot of sort of backroom politics going on, trying to figure out, what one side can get, how they can make something happen, how they can get the votes that they need to get in order to make the desired outcome be a thing. Now, each one of those congressmen out there, be they representatives or senators, they have different views on how to represent their people. Now, this can shift, not everyone is like one category, but generally speaking, when someone acts as a trustee, trustees are going to vote according to their conscience and thinking about the best interests of the nation. Okay, people who take on the role of trustees tend to be more tenured congressmen. They tend to have been in the job longer. They have the trust of their people. They're able to make decisions that they can then justify to people. It doesn't mean every single decision they made is completely on their own, but they tend to favor their own judgment and their own understanding of politics over lots of other things. Now, when representatives are acting as delegates, they act as according to the wishes of the voters. Now, typically, this is going to be younger, newer congressmen are very much going to want to mirror the ideas of the people who elected them. It's a great way to get reelected. But again, not all the time. Sometimes they have to vote for lots of different reasons, which brings us to the politicos. And the politicos really balance the idea between trustee and delegate based on the political landscape. They know, or they try to know, when it's good to vote according to their constituents, to vote with what their people want. But they also know when it's important to use their own conscience in a vote. But they also know when they need to follow their party leader in a vote. So there's a lot of very complicated things in here that make up congressional voting. But there are always influences on what's going on. So that, in a nutshell, is the legislative branch. Tomorrow night, we're going to get into the executive branch, talk about the presidency and the bureaucracy and those different, their roles in the whole policymaking process. So I really hope that you guys got a lot out of tonight's session. I hope that you guys now understand the legislative branch. And I'll kick it back to you, Liz, for any final thoughts that you have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. And like Paul said, tomorrow night is the executive branch and the bureaucracy. There are tons of review links right below anything that you need, including this presentation. But we are excited to see you tomorrow night for the executive branch and bureaucracy. Thank you, everyone.